everyone, in this time-lapse tutorial I'm going to show you how I did this drawing of Ronnie the German Shepherd. So like always, I start with the eyes first. I do like to make sure I've got the shape right, so there I use my black pencils just to get the outline correct. I will then usually, if I've got a brighter white highlight, map that in first. Then I'll focus more on the iris colour. Now, what I like to do when I've got an eye that's got a bright reflection that's particularly white, I will make sure that I put that in with a white pastel pencil first. The reason being, you then know that you've got that highlight as bright as you can get it. You haven't got to worry about overlapping that on top of existing pastel if you were to put the pupil or the iris in first. But if you have a highlight that's a little bit more muted, maybe a softer grey, more of a mid-blue from a sky reflection, then those you can get away with adding those on top of your existing layers. But if you do have that bright white highlight, it's usually a good idea to get that in first. Now, eyes are one of the trickier things to get right. It's all about the contrast and mainly where you put those shadows and the highlights. You'll notice that the outer edges of the eye are slightly darker and then the iris gets a little lighter towards the midsection. Now, how much detail you're able to get in the eye is going to really depend on how big and the scale that you're working on. This was A3 size, so it's about a 12 by 16. You can see from the size of the soft tool and the pencils when I was using them for the eye, it's not a large area. So I had to make sure that I'm really reinforcing my contrasts. By getting that highlight bright and then the pupil and around the eye nice and dark, it's automatically looking photorealistic even though the eye itself is fairly small. And of course, the larger that you work, the more detail you can fit in there. But that's really important, regardless of the scale that we're working on, that we're hinting at the 3D sphere shape of the eye. So you want to reinforce those shadows on the edges and then make sure, as I say, you get that highlight, if required, nice and bright. So on to the base layers. Now, I used my PanPastels for this, and I did like using a combination of the soft tools and then my eye makeup applicator sponges. I do find that the eye makeup applicator sponges, they are significantly cheaper to buy and you can get a lot more in each of the packs. You might potentially burn through them slightly quicker, but I think because of how much cheaper they are compared to the soft tools, I think it's worth it. So those two methods of putting down my PanPastels are my main preference. And if you've seen other videos here on YouTube of mine, you'll know that I really do focus a lot on the base layer. I think it's one of the most important parts of any portrait. I always make sure that I've got a really good base foundation. Now, I'm not focusing on the exact colour. That's not really important at this stage. I can adjust that later on with the layers that I'm going to build up and then glazes if I need to. But I am mapping in where my lights and my darks are. You'll also notice that I don't have any harsh edges, and I think this is really important when we are drawing any kind of fur, regardless of the texture. I don't want there to be any of those solid lines between my lights and my dark areas, because that's going to make it harder for me to build up the fur in a realistic way if I do have those harsh edges that I have to fight against. You'll also see that I like to work in multiple layers. I will build up many subtle layers, and that's something that I do with any type of animal that I'm working on. If we put our pastel down for the very first layer, like the PanPastels I've applied here, and then jump straight into our details, we are not going to be able to achieve the same degree of depth. I still want to make sure that I'm reinforcing that base layer. I'm getting it as closely and as accurate to that reference photo as I can. Once you feel like you've got a good solid base foundation, it's then when I am able to go in with my details. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I'm filling the tooth of the paper early on, because that's something that I am always aware of. Filling the tooth of the paper, you'll know when it happens because the pencil will feel like it's gliding over the surface, almost like the pigment of the pencil, it just can't come out of the lead. That's a good indication that the tooth of the paper has been filled. You can use a workable fixative in that instance to reapply tooth back to that paper, but it is always something to be aware of that the fixative can change the colour of your artwork, which is not ideal. Not the end of the world if it's only being used as a workable fixative, because you are going to be putting future layers on top, but it is something to be aware of. So because of that, I just avoid filling the tooth of the paper, and it's something then that I don't ever feel the need to work with a fixative at all. But if you haven't finished with that layer, that portrait, and you do apply that fixative, it does slightly adjust the colour, then it's no big deal because you are going to be putting your future layers on top. So here, this base layer is a prime example. Look at how I'm really mapping in where my darks are. I'm then fading it into the lighter browns next to it. These lovely burnt sienna, they get into more of a yellow ochre colours. I'm paying really close attention to that photo. One of the things that I go in depth with every tutorial is where you need to put your highlights and your shadows. Now, because predominantly the Patreon tutorials are in real time, I'm able to explain why I'm using that colour, the layering process, if there is a specific colour that I need to capture in that reference photo, but you don't have the exact pencil, there are going to be numerous layers that you're going to have to build up to get that colour. So all of these things are covered in depth with those tutorials. But next to that is also where your highlights and your shadows are. Where you put your highlights and your shadows within the face are going to determine the underlying bone and muscular structure. So for instance, take the highlight that I'm currently working on here, this larger area above the right eye. If I was to have shifted this an inch to the right hand side, I'm going to make his face look far wider than what it should be. So where we put these highlights and again the shadows are really important. I want to be focusing far more on my shadow and highlight placement more than the exact colour. Now, briefly mentioning colour selection, because this is something that's far easier to explain in the real-time tutorials. But here you'll notice all the colours that I'm selecting, regardless if they're my shadows or my highlights, they are all on the warmer end of the colour wheel. So I'm using pinks, burnt siennas, yellow ochres, burnt umbers. There are not even, there's no blues. I'm not really even using any black for my shadows. I'm just making sure that I'm using my darker browns. With every one of my Patreon tutorials, I always give a full list of all the colours that I'm using, from the PanPastels, the soft pastel sticks, to the pencils themselves. When I pick a specific colour, I will always say why I'm using that colour, if there is a specific layering process, because the way that you layer pastels is very similar to paints. If you pick up more pigment of one colour, you're going to end up with a slightly different colour than what potentially was intended. Now, that might not necessarily be a bad thing, you just could then add another colour to get it more accurate. And quite often we do need to use multiple layers and mix that pastel together with our pencils to create that one specific colour that we can see in that photo. But because this is something that is, it's challenging, it's one of the more challenging parts of any colour-based medium, and it's something that can be very stressful. I am going to make a dedicated section, more of like a series of tutorials, where I am picking particularly difficult fur colourings. I'm also going to be taking some suggestions for this as well. So Patreon members, if there is a specific fur colour that they find difficult, I will then try and find photographs of that animal so that I can put that in a tutorial. My plan is to then upload those as full-length tutorials, or maybe pick a specific section of that photo where the colour is particularly tricky, and then do that as a real-time tutorial where I can show you the colours that I'm going to be using, why I'm going to be doing it in a specific layering order to get that colour that I want, and then I'm hoping that that can then be transferred to my Patreon members and the pet portraits that they get asked to do. But I am certainly going to be turning that into more of a series on Patreon. So for instance, a yellow Labrador, there are often many greener tones that need to be used in there, and very rarely, often never, do you actually have to use a yellow pencil. It's like when you're drawing blonde hair. More often you're going to be going with creams and more of like a lighter ivory colour rather than a pure yellow pencil. And this portrait here, now that the ear is coming together, you can really see how that's taking shape. I'm using multiple pinks, and then I'll go on top with more of my lighter ivory colours, so that no one element is looking too yellow, but then it's not looking too pink. It's about finding that balance in between. So I need to layer the pencils together in order to get that outcome. So when it comes to the details within the ear, Ronnie had lovely detail within the ears. The whiter hairs here really looked like soft, and they were travelling in a few different directions. But you'll notice that I haven't jumped into those details first. I've started putting in a couple of my darker shadows in between where my details are going to be, and then I'm going over the top first of all with a lighter grey. I don't want to jump into my white pencils straight off, and first of all, because I need to build up, just like with the fur on the face, I need to build up the depth here gradually. Because quite often you will have more of like a grey detail within the ear first, and then the lighter white details need to go on top. That's showing that some of those ear hairs are not capturing as much of the light as the ones that are sitting on top and closer to the viewer. One thing as well that's important there is when I have just used at the moment that lighter grey pencil, notice how some of those pencil strokes look lighter than others. That's because I'm applying more pressure to that pencil. Now again, this is something that I speak in depth in my Patreon tutorials, because how you hold that pencil, the way that you move it, the way that you even have it held in terms of where your fingers are positioned on the barrel, how long that lead is, how short that point is, all of those things come into play depending on the different types of fur texture. So here, where I have said that I've applied more pressure to the pencil to get more of that brighter lead to come through, you can still see that I've got nice fine lines. So it is all about how you hold that pencil in order to get the best of both worlds there. So for example, if I was to put more pressure on that pencil but I didn't have a sharp enough point, and then I didn't have it held on the barrel in the right way, I'm just going to end up creating some very thick lines. That's not what I want for this kind of ear texture. And what I will also do is work on the outer edges of the ear first. Once I've got that completed, I can then start working on the details within the ear, just like what I'm doing now. The reason being, these details, they do overlap the outer parts of the ear. So I want to make sure that then whatever is behind those details is drawn in, so that then I don't have to draw around these longer ear hairs. That's going to make the whole process far longer and a lot more difficult. So because I knew that I'd drawn in the edges of the ear and I'd got them done, now that I'm overlapping these finer details, it's looking natural. These inner ear hairs are overlapping the outer parts of the ear. So by drawing those in first, I'm making it look natural and approaching it in the easiest way. When I'm working on a reference photo, I will always then look at whatever is next to it to see whether or not the fur overlaps in that area. If it does, I know then that I need to get that part in first and then come back to the bit that I was planning on doing. That's just going to make the whole process a lot easier. It's going to flow a lot nicer, and as I say, the fur will then look more natural. The reason being, whatever is overlapping another element will then be closer to the viewer. You've automatically then pushed that part of the fur backwards because it's got a section of fur that's overlapping, and that's really important when we're trying to capture realism in our artwork. If we don't have fur that's overlapping at different points, the portrait will look two-dimensional. For instance, as soon as I put the whiskers on at the very last layer, that's going to then bring that part of the nose closer to the viewer because the whiskers are overlapping everything else. So I have a video here on YouTube, and it's my top tips for drawing fur, which if you haven't seen that, I'll link that in the description below. Now, one of those top tips is how I like to work with my small sections. I focus on the fur direction and the fur length. These two things here will make such a difference to what this dog looks like. So if I was to be drawing my pencil strokes here longer than what's intended on the bridge of the nose, similar to the length of the fur on the face on the top of the head, I'm going to make it look like his nose is as hairy as the rest of his body, and of course that's not what I want. I want the bridge of the nose here in the muzzle area to look like the fur is shorter, because that's how normally for German Shepherds, Labradors, Springer Spaniels, those types of breeds, that is normally the case. And fur length, I think, is one of the things that isn't talked about enough. I think because it can really shift what that fur texture looks like, and predominantly then how much of that portrait resembles that reference photo, is something that we should be paying close attention to early on. The fur direction on the bridge of the nose here is really important. We want to get the fur direction accurate with any part of the portrait, but I think for this section here, it's quite easy to get a little bit sort of not follow the reference photo as closely as we should. We have a tendency to make the fur details too vertical, or we go the other way and just make them completely horizontal. What will happen is we'll make him look like the bridge of the nose. If they're too horizontal, the face will then look really wide, and if they're then too vertical, the face will look really long. So how we've got the pencil details here is going to make a big difference to the overall end result of this portrait. Even with a longer coated dog like a cockapoo, for instance, where that fur originates from, where it's coming from the skin, is going to tell that viewer the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now, I do have videos of those kinds of breeds here on YouTube as well, so I'll have them in my Pastels playlist, which I will link at the end of this video. Because I do layer, of course, that fur very differently. That is very much about the clumps of fur and the way that we need to order that layer in order to get that fur type realistic. but the way that that first pencil stroke is started from, where it's positioned, how long the pencil strokes are, and so on, are all going to influence what this animal looks like. So my Patreon channel focuses more on the pet portrait side of things. I do have quite a lot of wildlife subjects there as well, but I do like to try and get as many domestic pets on there so that anybody who potentially wants to do pet portrait commissions full time has a range of breeds there that they can then implement the tips and techniques in their own work. And a German Shepherd was one of those that was frequently requested, so I do have a couple of tutorials of that available over there now as full-length tutorials, one of which is this one here on the left. So this is Dingo. The reference photo and liner are provided along with all of the colours that I have used. So if any of my slower tutorials are of interest in pastels or acrylics, I will link my Patreon channel in the description below. So the fur direction on the side of Ronnie's face here, you'll see that it's really curving down towards the lower right corner. The reason being, this is going to be slightly different, and this would be different if I had the same, similar photo of him, but he wasn't smiling, so if his mouth was closed. That wouldn't potentially make the fur direction here travel in the same way. But because he is panting, the mouth is open, the fur then is being pushed out towards more of an angle. So I have to make sure that I get the fur direction in place and correct through any part. Because as I say, it really does change what that animal looks like. If I had the fur that was not looking realistic here, it's therefore not going to flow with the shape of the mouth in the same way. It all is like a chain reaction. And that's the reason why I like to work in small sections. So I will only take one part at a time. If I do a base layer, like with this one side of the face here, I will block that base layer in. But then when I work on the fur, I'm only focusing on 1 or 2 square inches at a time. I find that this does make the whole process far less daunting, and I'm actually a lot more effective and efficient with how I work. So if you're finding that you're spending a lot more time just staring at that reference photo, not quite sure what you should be working on, it's usually because you're focusing on too much of a larger area. When we're working on the whole set layers, it can be very easy to get a bit distracted with the one part that we're working on. Now, if that layering technique does work for you and that's your preference, then that's great. Whatever works for the individual artist. But if you do find that you're hesitating a lot more, or you have a tendency of not finishing your artwork, you get to a certain point and you put it aside and you start something else, it is usually because you're working on a larger area. So when you get onto the mouth of any pet portrait, I do think it's one of those elements that can be very easy for our brain to play tricks on us. Our brain has a tendency to think, I know what a dog's tongue looks like, I'm going to draw it like this. Whereas we then don't follow that reference photo as closely as we should do. What you can do in that situation is then turn your artwork and your reference photo upside down, and then your brain will be forced to see it as shapes, like abstract shapes, rather than a dog's mouth. That's going to be far easier to then get that looking realistic. The colour of the tongue is also going to vary. Sometimes you might be required to use more blues and purples if the white balance of the photograph is on the cooler end of the colour wheel. As I've said throughout this tutorial, I used a lot more of my warmer colours. So although I'm using some purples at the base of the tongue closer to the nose, that's because that's where the darker part is, so you've got that shadow where the light can't reach the back of the throat in the same way as the end of the tongue itself. So I need to make sure that I'm using the right colours in the right areas. But if you've got a reference photo that is generally cooler all over, you may be required to use purples throughout the entire tongue. It is going to vary depending on that reference. So for the body here, I'm really focusing on getting my edges nice and soft into that dark grey colour of the Pastelmat paper. I'm using my favourite shaped soft tool, which is the oval sponge, and it works really well for creating nice soft edges. My preference is always either the round or the oval because of that. The triangular shape, although it's great if you want to use it up for more of your straighter edges, when you're trying to get a soft blended transition like what I am here, it's very easy to get harsh start and stop points throughout each of the blending strokes. I don't really like that for my base layer, so the oval and the round shapes are always my preference. And here you can see that I have mapped in all of the chest, and it's quite a large area for what I typically like to work with. But the reason is I wanted this to be nice and soft and blended. So once I got my colour combinations with my PanPastels in front of me, I thought it was just easier to map in the entire base layer. Now another reason why I opted for this is the fur on the body here is significantly longer than the fur on the face. So because of that, I'm going to have to make sure that my base layer is even more softer, much more blended than even what I did on the face itself. That's because I want this fur to look soft. There needs to be no harsh transitions between my shadows and my highlights. Here now where I'm adding my pencils on top, that's where I can refine more of these darker colours and then those subtle highlights on top. Now my biggest tip when you're working on soft fur like this, especially longer soft fur, is you need to work with subtle layers. You can notice here, just like with the face, I'm not jumping into my brightest pencils first. If I do that, I'm going to have hardly no depth within this fur. It's not going to look soft, and it is going to look a little bit more on the coarser type of texture rather than the longer fur that this German Shepherd has. So this pencil here is in a silver pencil extender. The ones that I like to use are by Derwent. They come in a pack of 2. You can get a black one that's really nice for your narrower pencils like your Carbothellos and your Pitts, and then the silver one there is for more of your thicker pencils, so the Derwent and the Caran also fit in there as well. What that means is when you do have a pencil that's getting a little bit too short, very like this one here that I was just working with, you can then put that across into a pencil extender so you can get the most out of every single pencil. As we know, art supplies aren't cheap, so we don't want to have to be throwing any pencils away before the necessary time. So the pencil extenders really do work well. It does mean then you can get better leverage on that pencil for those details. Working with very short pencils like that, it really does force more pressure on that lead. We're not going to then be able to get the details in the same way as when you're working with a longer pencil. So as soon as you get down to anything less, ideally than 3 inches, I would usually put that then in a pencil extender. Now when I was using that pencil that you saw briefly there, I didn't have that in an extender because I was only working on my base layer. If I was working with any kind of detail there, that pencil would have been far too short. So I've spoken about it a lot in this video, but notice here on the body where the fur gets longer, you can really see how I'm changing and shifting that fur direction. Sometimes it curves down towards the lower left corner, then it gradually curves over in the opposite direction down towards the right corner. All of these gradual soft transitions are going to give the form and shape of the neck and the chest area. We can have a real tendency sometimes to just draw the fur details like in a straight line with no curvature to them, especially when we get down here to the neck part. You want to make sure obviously that the head looks like it's attached to the fur on the body. If we have the fur direction that completely changes all of a sudden, it is then going to look like the head has just been stuck on, which of course is not what we want. The fur direction here is really important. Now one quick tip, and I go in depth with this on a Patreon tutorial where I'm showing you exactly how to fade out a chest and get that nice soft transition. But you'll notice that when I get those details closer to the lower faded area, I'm really easing off on that pencil. The details are not as bright or as visible as the ones closer to the tongue. That's going to help to create that nice soft transition into the paper of whatever colour that you've chosen to work on. Here is a photo of Ronnie's finished portrait. If you would like to see how I tackle a German Shepherd portrait, as you saw in the middle of the video, I do have Dingo the German Shepherd's tutorial available over there as a full-length video. Reference photo and liner are included. So if you would like to watch that or any of my other tutorials, the link to my Patreon is in the description below. Now what I also have on my website is a Patreon library where you can see all of the tutorials that are available over there on each tier. So you can see the sort of content that is available on Patreon before you sign up. Now the good thing with Patreon is you can cancel at any time, and if you've got any questions about anything like that, anything art related, pop them in the comments below. I am more than happy to help. So I hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video are useful. If they were, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you want to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. Have a lovely long Easter weekend, and I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube very soon.